Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual home of Princeton Public Library here on Zoom. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the Adult Programming Manager at the Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to host this evening's program, where we have Jay Baruch in conversation with Suzanne Koven to discuss Dr. Baruch's recently released book of narrative essays, Tornado of Life, a doctor's tales of constraints and creativity in the ER. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Nicholas DiSapantino of MIT Press for all of their assistance with arranging the details for tonight. If you would like to purchase Tornado of Life from MIT Press, I will be putting the link in the chat to help direct you to the various places. Please note that this event is being recorded, and our events typically go up on the library's YouTube channel within a few days. If you have friends or colleagues who could not make it tonight, let them know that it has been recorded so they can share in this event. I will now introduce our guests and ask them to turn on their cameras to join us on the screen. During their conversation, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function or in the chat for either of our panelists to answer at the end of their conversation. First, I'll introduce Jay Baruch, who is a practicing emergency room physician, a professor of emergency medicine at Alpert Medical School of Brown University, and the author of 2 award-winning short fiction collections, What's Left Out and 14 Stories, Doctors, Patients, and Other Strangers. He is joined tonight by Suzanne Koven, who is also a writer and a primary care physician and the inaugural writer-in-residence at Mass General Hospital. She is the author of Letter to a Young Female Physician, Thoughts on Life and Work. We are so lucky to have both of you here tonight, and I'm thrilled. I'm going to make myself invisible and let you two take it away.
Thank you so much. This is such a thrill for me. I absolutely loved this book, and I can't wait to talk with you about it, Jay. But first, I wonder if you could read a little bit for us, just so we get a sense of just how good it is to start us off.
I will. Hey, yeah, thank you, Suzanne. And hello, everybody. Thanks for showing up, making time out of your busy day to join us. I am tickled and thrilled, not just to be here with you all, but also to be here in conversation with Suzanne, someone who I respect dearly and who I admire immensely. And we have to do something like this in order to talk directly. We can't just go off to Boston and chat. Go figure. Okay, so I am going to read just a little bit of the title essay, which is called Tornado of Life, and it's just the beginning. And just to give a sense of the essay collection is very varied in tone. But this one is somewhat somber, and I apologize to lead off like that, but I think it's a very important essay and gets to the heart of some of the issues that we'll probably touch upon during the next hour. Tornado of Life. Cheryl overdosed on heroin the night before, but that's not the reason she's in the ER late the next day, sitting in her gurney, confused. She woke up this morning so upset to be alive, she kicked a wall at the homeless shelter and broke her toe. But that's not why she's in the ER either. Something came up a few weeks ago that made her miss her appointment at the methadone clinic. That absence got her kicked out of the clinic for 30 days, or so she said. The withdrawal symptoms made her want to die, and returning to heroin was the easiest solution. But wanting to stop using heroin isn't the reason she's in the ER. Then her boyfriend died unexpectedly. It wasn't related to the drug use, or so she said. He was in his 30s, an age when hearts don't just give out. He was her love, her reason for getting clean, but he also found her veins. So when she needed heroin after he died, she skin popped. Angry-looking scars pockmark her arms. She extends them to me and looks away, but neither shame nor infection drove her to the ER late at night. The police had been called for a disturbance in the shelter that involved Cheryl. She wouldn't shut up, and her mouth earned her a ride to the ER. She didn't want to be here. She made that point loud and painfully clear. Yet she complained about the wait to see a doctor. She yelled for attention and then yelled at the responding nurse that she wanted to be left alone. When I entered her room and asked what we could do for her, she clammed up. Cheryl? Her cheeks and jawline were sharp, the sadness in her sea blue eyes striking. She was thin, too thin, and anxious, practically jumping out of her skin. Symptoms of narcotic withdrawal, or so she said. But these symptoms could also be a separation from and a need for a more potent substance, hope. When I asked Cheryl about what I had read at her medical record, did she want to kill herself, she turned away and didn't answer. I sat there, resisting the urge to fill the silence. Finally, Cheryl took a deep breath and said, I'm stuck in a tornado of life. What do you say to someone caught up in a tornado of life, whose problems are so woven into other problems that you're almost afraid to tug at a single thread for fear of everything unraveling? I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for reading that. So, you've set me up wonderfully for my first question. You've
Yes.
played right into my
Yes.
my hand. So my question is, I think this passage, this book, reflects twin loves. One, the love of medicine, and specifically the love of the ER.
Hmm.
And two, the love of language and storytelling. Which came first for you? Which ambition came first for you?
Love of language,
Writing or medicine?
writing. I never thought I'd be a doctor until I went to college. And so I was going to be, I can't explain this as I was going to be a writer and an English professor, and I just loved books. When I was growing up, I just thought that writers were some of the most important people. For some reason, I thought books were just extraordinary objects to have on your shelf. And and I lamented even as a young age the fact I'll never get a chance to really read all the great books out there, and I still haven't. And as I'm getting closer to very old, I'm very aware of that limitation, times ebbing. But actually, when it wasn't until I got to college when I actually I was entertaining. I suddenly just became attracted to medicine and healing, and I don't know whether my lack of interest in medicine had to do with lack of interest in medicine, or just a really strong belief that I would never get into medical school, so why even think about it. And then I took a class where part of it involved going to a local hospital, and of course, being a young college student, there's very limited stuff that you can do without being dangerous. And so what we did is we actually, part of it was actually talking to patients. And I remember having this one chaplain who let us talk to patients on the oncology floor of all places, and just engaging with their stories and seeing life on a totally different level. And to then to be in the position to actually impact these stories was my entryway into even considering medicine.
Mhm. Yeah, people often ask me, how I combine my two careers, and my answer, which maybe sounds glib, but is sincere, is that writing and medicine don't feel different to me. They feel like they involve the same impulses, the same issues, and I feel that your book actually expresses that very well in different ways. So going back to the piece you read, answer me this. When the patient says it's a tornado of life, what percent of your brain at that point, it's now 2 a.m.,
Hmm.
is saying, damn, that's a great phrase. That's beautiful. That's poetry. I'm going to write about that.
Well, I actually did write about it, but for myself, I put it, I mean, I've always used sort of writing as a way to work through challenging experiences. I think it's always been a way for me to control the uncontrollable, or to be able to have space to confront things and situations that seem just more challenging than we let on to be. And I've always worked through that through the physical act of writing, and it's never intended actually to be published. It's actually just meant for me. And then over time, they accrue, and I find that certain situations resonate with other situations, or I hear other people saying, "We don't talk about this," or "This answer to this issue was not really addressed in a way that I felt was sufficient." And I find that what we do, Suzanne, as writers, is like we embrace this complexity, right? Like that's what makes really interesting writing, is when we're really unpacking these moments. And so these pieces, and this piece in particular, like had a long gestational period before it sort of found its way into the light, so to speak.
How far into your medical career were you before you started publishing? And
Oh,
how did you transition from, I'm writing for myself, I'm keeping a journal, I'm working things through, to being a professional writer? How did that happen?
um, very painfully slow. I don't I don't think I will go on record. I don't think anyone has been rejected as much as I have. I think I have, somewhere probably 1,000 rejection slips. I used to pepper when I was living in New York in my apartment in Brooklyn, and I mean they were I used to wallpaper my kitchen, everything with all these rejection slips, and it's not like a macabre thing. It was like, in a way, it was like I was just writing and I was sending stuff out. So I took a year off in medical school to write a really bad novel. It's not like I had any grand plans. I didn't get an MFA. I got a I got a master's in being Jay, which means I always took a slow roundabout way. I had to work in order to do that. So I was working at a different type of job in publishing and writing, and I wrote a really bad novel, and then I wrote another really bad novel. And then I decided I had to learn how to write, by taking some of the feedback I was getting from editors at that time, from editors who were gracious enough to give me some insight into what was missing in my work. And then so it was solid 10 years of getting a lot of rejections.
Mhm, mhm. And something I always think about in terms of the many differences between the culture of literature and publishing and the culture of medicine, and why it can be very hard to toggle between the two, is that in medicine we don't get rejected. Once you get yourself into medical school, you got one foot on the train, you keep going. And I was so naive about this that I had beginner's luck with my very first submission. It got into JAMA, and
Yeah,
I thought,
good for
wow,
you.
the editor is my new best friend. She'll
Yeah.
publish anything I send to her. And then I sent her the next thing, and I got a form rejection without even a little comment. So you chose emergency medicine, which is a very particular thing. I think for our listeners who aren't in medicine, I think it's pretty accurate to say that the big branch point for medical students is, do I want to be do I want to go into some form of internal medicine and its subspecialties, or do I want to be a surgeon? And then, there's psychiatry is sort of maybe the sort of third branch. Um, I don't know if it's different now, but I think when we were coming through, emergency medicine was not an obvious choice.
Uh,
Why was it for you?
well, it wasn't. I was going to be a psychiatrist. I had all intentions of going, like that's what all the people I admire, the writers, like I loved Robert Cole's work, and I was like, oh, God, I'm going to be, and it seemed like it was great. I got a chance to examine, think about patients and character and mental illness and motivation, and it just felt like such a natural fit. And I actually did a couple rotations in psychiatry, and I really, really loved it. I mean, I still love psychiatry, and it was too much. It was so much time inside my head. Like I don't even want to be inside my head. And I was in a lot. Being inside my head is not exactly a great place to be, and I know because I'm inside my head most of the time. Um, but I ended up doing a rotation in emergency medicine, and at that time, this is even before the show ER was out. At the time, like ER had like a very sort of macho, like leather jacket mentality. And that's not me. I fail at that bravado. And but when I was in the ER, I sort of really, I just, you you can intellectualize it. I think like most of us, Suzanne, I don't know whether you did this, but at one point I sat down and put down, okay, what are some of the things I'm thinking about going into? And then you put your pluses, your pros, and your cons, and you try to figure it out. Just like, making any kind of decision. And then sometimes you just go into a space and you go, you know what, this space terrifies me, but I feel comfortable here. Like I'm comfortable with this discomfort. There's something about it that challenges me, that makes me feel alive, that makes me feel like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It's not like it's calling. I don't want to be overly overly melodramatic about it, but it's just like it defied all logic. So I actually had to change. I had to have my dean's letters change and
Mm,
everything to go into this thing called emergency medicine.
yeah, and so this is sort of the where I'm leading here is I think a lot of what this book is about is the particular narrative quality of the emergency room. I've
Right.
never read this written about, talked about, or described, which is why I was so enchanted with the book. You quote a dean of your medical school as saying, internal medicine, which is what I do, is the novel. I mean, I take care of people for 30 years.
Right.
I took care of their parents. I take care of their children.
Right.
I don't work shifts,
Right.
you know.
Right.
I don't wear scrubs.
Right.
I don't
Right.
do blood. Um, uh, anyway, so this dean said internal medicine is the novel. So far, so good.
Right.
Emergency medicine is the short story.
Right.
What he said, okay. What he said after that is, and everybody knows there's no good short story writers. That's where he lost me and you too. But what is the particular narrative quality of the emergency room? At what point you say it's narrative gold, and it can be that part I'm paraphrasing, this part I'm quoting, it can be a narrative disaster.
Yeah.
I want you
Yeah.
to dilate on that point because it's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of realized, early on that the things that terrified me the most, right? I sort of had a sense on, like I knew what to do, cardiac arrest, I knew what to do, traumas, I knew what to do, this stuff that was really that would really worried me. I actually had a handle on because oftentimes it was an identifiable problem with a delineated next steps. Like you knew what it was. Some of it was algorithmic, some of it was more obvious. You knew what you had to do. The things I wasn't prepared for was just those situations, which were often not infrequent, where it was patient stories, and I was trying to get a sense of what their needs are. And patients aren't cases to be solved, but stories to be explored and understood. And I had to change the paradigm, and I actually had to draw on my creative writing skills. And I just saw like what we were doing in the emergency department. I can't decide what to do with a patient. I can't even decide on the technology that needs to be used, or what bloods needs to be drawn, or how much to respond, unless I get the story right. So I saw it as primarily a story activity. Like I had to get the story right. And yet the emergency department, like, it's busy, it's loud, there's lack of privacy, it's strangers talking to strangers. It can feel like a really bad first date with someone at a critical moment of their life, right? Like they don't just come in and say, "Hey doc, how you doing?" Sometimes it's like that,
That's what I do.
but most of the time it is like they're coming at a high point. Like the decision to come to the emergency department is never made lightly, right? And so you're meeting them at this heightened moment in their lives, a narrative event in their lives. And you have to, and we don't really understand it and frame it in that way. And for me, and I think maybe because I came at this as not like a scientist, but as a writer first, it seems so obvious. I'm in a corner by myself in a lot of these thinking. But
Mhm.
it felt like primarily a story activity. I was a professional story listener, listening to storytellers under really difficult conditions.
Yeah. One of the things you write about is lessons that can be learned from literature that could be applied in the emergency room. You focus particularly on the short stories of Chekhov, who, of course, himself was a physician for a while, and how the stories end with ambiguity. Um, uh, they're not tidy, uh, and you feel that that physicians, particularly in the emergency room, might borrow some of that ambiguity and uncertainty. Can you tell us about an incidence where it's better to be uncertain than to be certain? I think many people would be surprised by that sentiment.
Yeah, we so much of medicine, regardless of what we do, like in the primary care, and anybody who really deals with undifferentiated patients with a host of problems, there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty in diagnosis, there's uncertainty in prognosis, there's uncertainty in our communication. There's uncertainty in the nature of the stories that patients tell us. I make this mistake all the time. Sometimes I'll tell students, whatever, go get the patient's story as if it's like this thing and they're going to go and bring it back. Like, this is the patient's story. But oftentimes what we get is first drafts of their story. Like, they're trying to take a complex experience and put language to it, and sometimes it's the questions you ask prompts different parts of the story, and they'll give you all this information, and you have to figure out, where does the story begin, or what really belongs and what doesn't belong. Or when you hear silences and gaps, and going, God, what are they not telling me that I have to pursue? And before I can think about what the right answers are, I really have to think about what questions am I asking? Am I asking the right questions of the patient under this particular situation? And I write in the book about a particular situation early on in my career, when I was working in an inner city, hospital in New York City, and I was a young attending, and I had this really sort of very well dressed uh a woman who was, as I said in the piece, was the best smelling and probably the most well put together person in the ER, and that includes the staff. And she had vague complaints, and I was like going back, I was being conscientious and diligent, and I couldn't get it right. Like, I couldn't get a sense of what was going on. And she mentioned like chest pain and shortness of breath, or maybe she just nodded to my questions. Regardless, that I said, you know what, I'm going to pursue that. Like, that gave me something to hold on to. Test through the night, nothing shows up. She's not complaining. Like, she's sitting there, she's amongst like some intoxicants, some other people acting like on a typical weekend night. And the morning comes, and she's grateful and she says, thank you. And then when I ask her about, do you want us to give you a call your husband, or come pick you up? She says no. And basically her phrasing was such that she wanted me to know something, and what she wanted me to know was the fact that the real reason she was there was because she was basically the victim of interpersonal violence, and that had been going on for years, and she'd finally had enough. And of course, now we know, like the literature says, that you have to ask, that question. And back then, I was so caught up with trying to with what does she have? I wasn't thinking about it in sort of a writerly way and say, God, what am I missing? And why is she here? What motivates this woman who looks so put together? There's nothing vague about her, yet her story is vague. So what am I missing? And I said that something in the piece I write about how I was conscientious and diligent and entirely devoid of any imagination. And that's what I needed at that moment. I needed clinical imagination.
Clinical imagination, that's such a wonderful phrase. Do you think that we should be, well, this is a softball because you know what I would think about this and I know what you would think about this, but we'll play it out. Do you think that we should be training clinicians to be more imaginative?
Oh yeah, I've written elsewhere about the how I think how I look at my work is I feel that we need to be sort of like evidence-based, evidence-using artists, depending upon what we're doing, because our patients, they don't read the books, they don't know, they don't read the books. Oftentimes, what we deal with is there's no algorithm for that, right? There's no huge research clinical trial that covers that. And even if it was, how do you interpret something that applies to 10,000 patients to this one patient, right?
Yeah.
And I quote one of my favorite narrative scholars, Catherine Montgomery, in the book, and she in her seminal book called the Doctor Stories, which was one of the books that sort of got me involved and interested in the relationship between narrative and clinical medicine. Is she said something to the effect of, physicians, work to perfect the maps of illness, but each patient and each instance of illness is uncharted territory. And I think being open to the fact that there's oftentimes uncharted territory that patients want us to travel to with them, or at least be curious about, is critically important.
I feel moved to ask about COVID now because the emergency room and the ICU were sort of COVID ground zeros, grounds zero, and I would think, given all we've said, that the narrative quality of the emergency room became more intense and also more disastrous, to use your terms. Can you tell us about both of those?
Well, it was think about it. There's the disease itself, especially in the beginning, right? When we did not know what we were dealing with, we were all trying to figure out what this thing is on the fly. And we were scared, we were a little bit terrified, we were taking all these precautions. But at the same time, Suzanne, I mean, at least from my experience and the people that I was working with, it was the place that I was most at risk for catching COVID. And yet it was also the place that I felt safest.
Yes, me too.
Because I trusted these people. I trusted the team that I had worked with. I trusted, from the nurses to the techs to the unit secretaries. We had been through so much together, right? And for many of us, this was, many of us got so, it was easy to, as the years have progressed, to become disenchanted with the medicine and sort of what are we really about? Is it a business? Is it, is it become a what are the political dimensions of what we're doing? And suddenly this thing comes along, and for many of us, we felt like this is why we're here. This is why we're
We came
here.
up big
This is why we're here,
and fast. Yes.
right. And so, there was an inspiring and meaningful dimension to that. Well, at the same time, we were covered. I had my shield. We didn't have a PPE, right? So our mask, our N95 was gold. We had another surgical mask on top of that. I had a shield. Wearing this garb. Patients are wearing their. So it was so hard to actually. And then there was no family there, right? So it was so hard to do the thing that was so at the core of what we do, which is understand each other through telling stories. It's not just in medicine. We meet each other on the street. We meet each other in a bar. How are you doing? I mean, we start telling stories. That's how we communicate. That's how we express ourselves, understand our relationship to the world. We understand others. We learn about things. It's through storytelling. And then it's more so when they in the clinical setting has multiple purposes. And that was compromised by just the sheer amount of barriers, like the physical barriers. And then there was like the emotional barriers that ended up going on top of that with each successive wave. And it was, it's a thing.
Yeah, it was a thing. Um, you you had your own pretty serious health challenge, which you write about in the book. How did
Right.
that change your relationship to storytelling in medicine?
Well, that's a loaded question because I found like the storyteller in me and this I don't like neat stories. Like I always feel like if it works out neatly, that's great. But I always felt like that one of the challenges I had when I was sick and I had like I write about like some heart valve problems and some heart rhythm problems and some open heart surgery and some various other things that I had to have done. Is that I couldn't just be a patient. Like I had to be like people, especially from the healthcare team, they wanted to know like, what does it feel like? And so, and is it going to change the way you practice? And I felt like I was not just a patient, I was a physician patient. And I was also like this parable, like this moral tale, which is like, this is going to be a transformative event for me. This is going to, and hopefully I wasn't that much of an ogre before I got sick. I don't think I had to transform that much. However, it was complicated. So like there were aspects of it that did change me, right? Like I realized the the weight of waiting, like the burden of waiting for information, being in the hospital, being on a stretcher. Um, uh, I, 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 I embrace all the people who work who are not the doctors, like the nurses, the physical therapists, the techs, people, the radiology techs, people who just sort of made me feel comfortable, and like the impact of these people doing their jobs just makes this crazy space like somewhat like you feel less alone in it because you spend most of your time with a lot of the other healthcare providers who are caring for you. And I also realized how awful and how onerous and how I think malignant the healthcare system can be. Sometimes, like in my encounters with insurance companies and with the bureaucracy was actually worse than the disease itself, as awful as I felt. So when I was a physician, I felt like I was going out of my way more so to satisfy, to try to put people and put patients and their families in a better position moving forward.
Mhm.
But then also there were other things like I was less tolerant of people who never said thank you, who were unappreciative. It was a very, very complicated experience for me, and one that has changed me in ways I think people expect maybe physicians to be impacted by being a patient, and perhaps in other ways that maybe that as I write in the book or might be considered a little bit less praiseworthy.
Yeah, you point out that we are so enamored of redemption stories
Right.
that sometimes, we want to slot, we want to force that narrative,
Right. Right.
and not every story is a redemption story,
I
and in fact,
know.
most are more complicated than that.
And even if they are a redemption story, it's more than that, right? That's what I think that's where we I think we're open to those possibilities, right? Of it not just being one thing. Yes, even if there is a redemptive element to it, there's also other aspects, there's thornier sides to it, which is what makes them really interesting stories,
Mhm.
right?
So speaking of patient stories, I'm going to anticipate a question that I'm going to bet someone's wondering about, particularly if they've read your book. You include a patient story in virtually every essay.
Yeah.
Often it's your format is there's a patient story, there's a sort of an expansive discussion about the issues that it raises for you. You then return to the story, and we sometimes find out how it ended, and sometimes we don't find out how it ended, per what you just said. What did you do about the patient confidentiality issue, especially since some of these people were folks you saw in the emergency room decades ago?
Yeah.
Did you change the details? How did you manage that?
Yeah, I did more than that. So and there's actually and oftentimes like this is handled like through a disclaimer, like we change identifiable details, so to speak. But I actually part of the book really sort of addresses some really challenging issues that we face, and I felt like this was a particularly challenging issue that was going to come up. I've written about it and talked about it in the past, so I actually dedicated a distinct essay to it. I wanted it to be part of the narrative itself, and it's towards the end of the book. And so I felt like, even just changing details isn't enough. Um, and 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 so how I approach this is that what what details do I feel like are mine? Like it's mine. And of course, there's going to be patients going to be part of those patients going to be part of those stories, especially if they take place in the ER. What are those what are those details that are patient oriented alone and perhaps are relevant but might not be relevant to the issue that I'm writing about? What details are shared custody of the two of us? And then what needs to be left off the table entirely?
Mhm.
And so I literally scrubbed. I mean, and it went through each rewrite went through these things. So yes, I changed identifiable detail. I changed certain things I didn't think were relevant to the particular issue, the story itself, because it wasn't because it was unnecessary. I didn't want to expose anybody. And then scrubbed, and then scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. And the standard I ended up using, Suzanne, at the end, and I write about in the essay on this, is I appealed to the imagination.
Mhm.
And that is, I imagine the patient looking over my shoulder as I'm writing this
Mhm.
and saying, and then would they still respect me? Would they think I'm being honest and fair and trustworthy? And would they still respect me as a physician? Because when I'm caring for patients, I'm not I don't have my writer's hat on. I have my doctor's hat. I can't do that. I can't do both. Which is one of the reasons why many of these pieces are so short, because that's really all I wrote about. I wrote about a particular challenge in that particular moment.
Mhm.
And so what is built around that challenge? And then that's what I have. I couldn't work with what I don't have necessarily have.
Mhm. Um, I want to ask one more question before we throw it open to the audience. Um, and you'll permit me to kind of go a little bit, literary nerd for a minute.
Sure.
I'm very interested in your craft in what you do with the essay form. Some of your essays read like, I think recognizably, personal essays, like standard personal essays. Some of your essays read sort of have a more editorial feel to them. Some of them almost more of a kind of a blog feel to them. And then there are at least a couple that are barely a couple of sentences long. So, for example, here's one of your essays in its entirety. Catheters. I asked the nursing home resident to explain the indwelling catheter in her bladder placed during her last hospital admission weeks earlier. How should I know? You go to the hospital and come out with these things. The end. Is that an essay? And if it is an essay, what is an essay?
Yeah, I wanted to play with the form. I didn't want to only write about an experience. I actually wanted to take readers into the experience, so they have a sense of what it's like to sort of go from story to story. Sometimes and all these encounters are very, very different. And that was purposeful. I mean, I'm a big fan of writing as short as possible. And I literally cut and cut and cut and cut until unless and every sentence has to pull its weight. And like even my editors were like, we're done. And I go, no, we can go shorter. We can change it.
That's reportable.
And yeah, I have. And so and I like, and I love writers who manage to, use the form to make us think differently. And I don't want to be afraid of white space, And so it's like for I love people like Lydia Davis, who writes short, and her pieces are all, provocative and interesting, and sometimes capture a world in
microfiction. Yeah.
10 sentences, and so there are several writers who are like that, who I just truly love. And I use that as sort of my model so it was very, very intentional to structure it as a bunch of really short pieces. And part of it is trying to realize that certain experiences, very profound experiences that can demonstrate and tell so much, and can reveal so much, can be in such a small, can be in a little bit of a,
You mean like kind
space.
of like an emergency room visit?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it mimics the rhythm of the emergency room.
Right.
My essays, my essays are a little bit more internal medicine.
They're beautiful essays.
You get the whole family history, and
they're beautiful.
Anyway, but no, it just occurs to me now, this does read a little bit more.
Yes, and that's intentional.
ER, which is great. Yeah. Anyway,
I was going to say, as I was observing your conversation tonight, it seems as if even in conversation, the fact that you are both doctors shows up in the way the dialogue has gone forth, in the use of some of the language. I'm not sure you're even aware of it, like that you scrubbed things, that you're cutting. It kind of, it's like you're performing surgery here in an interview.
We can't help ourselves.
You can't help yourselves. Exactly. And I also, Jay, I just want to comment to you, like when I was reading this book, I've often been accused of being what my one professor called a verbosivore. And I always try to cut down my writing, and you're inspiring me to get towards that brevity that I never seem to be able to reach. I'm always overwriting. And I do think that the way these essays, it's so lovely too. I love books where you can just pick it up, dip into it, read 2 or 3, put it down, come back at another time and be inspired and not have to feel that need. And I love that about this particular book.
Thank you.
And so congratulations on that. And I'm so glad that MIT Press reached out to have us host this conversation. I'm encouraging other people to put their questions in the chat. We do have one here from Jacqueline Genovese, who says, "Masters in being Jay, LOL." So I think this might be somebody who knows you, because she says, "Hi, Jay, great to see you." What would you say?
Hey, Jackie.
Yeah. What would you say to medical students about how to balance a creative practice and medicines as students in a way that can hopefully carry into their clinical practice?
Uh, I'm gonna say a few words, and then I'm also gonna ask Suzanne to jump in because she does a lot of this work. I I find that often what my primary role is to give them permission to be the creative people that they are. I mean, we accept so many infinitely. I do so like the amount of things I actually really do well are probably like I write, and I hopefully I'm a good doctor, and I hopefully and when I said became older, I hopefully I became a better writer. But some of these our students are so accomplished and so many different things, and they have this ability, like they are creative, like they and they just need permission, and they need people to say, listen, it's okay to bring these skills and this side of you into the clinical encounter, um, and to sort of open up to the various different paradigms and different tools that we need in our tool belt. It's not like we need to be crazy writers or crazy artists and taking care of patients. We need to be science using experts, like we got to know stuff, but it's not the only thing. And as patients become more complex and the challenges they face are more complex, we need to be able to like leverage the skills that they already have. And if they don't have them, I feel like there are so many students who want to, it seems like a very human thing for us to be able to do. And I think it's just, I don't think it's extra. I think it's absolutely critical and foundational to what we do as physicians.
Yes, absolutely. As I say, and if I say this to younger audiences, they often don't get the reference. But medical humanities and the humanities in general, it's not like an after-school specials thing. It's not mushy squishy. It is the life's blood of the exam room, getting the story right, understanding the language, and so forth. In terms of our students. Um, uh, Here's what I find fascinating um, and really mystifying is that though medical humanities has have blossomed in the past few decades, students still seem to often have the same idea I had 40
Right.
years ago, which is, well, let's see, when I started medical school, I followed the sign to the right that said science.
Mhm.
So, like, maybe if I have some time and I'm not overtired, well, that's never going to happen. I can read at night, but that's over there somewhere.
Right.
That's how I felt when I was an English major in college. Then I went to medical school and I thought, all right, so I made my choice. So that's that. And I didn't revisit the humanities seriously until my 40s,
Yeah.
which was,
Yeah.
a great loss in retrospect for me. And I used to think, well, it's good that students don't feel that way anymore. They do feel that way. I give talks to undergraduates where they come up to me afterwards and say, "Really, I can go to medical school and, and be an English major? Really?"
Yeah.
Yes, of course you
Yes.
can. And the irony is that a lot of students who get into medical school, it's very hard to get into medical school. They
Right.
get into medical school by having been super achieving people in multiple spheres. They play the violin.
Right.
They won the spelling bee. They,
Right.
they won the essay contest. And then they reach this finish line and somehow they get the idea, mostly because we give it to them, that, okay, now that other stuff gets put aside. And then if you say, you know what, you could bring your violin to clinic, and it's a revelation. And one
Right.
thing COVID did, one hates to say anything nice about COVID,
Mhm.
but one thing COVID did is I think it loosened some of these rigid boundaries, so uh, hierarchical boundaries, role boundaries, and medical staff,
Right.
so you had string quartets, the ICU and in the vaccine tents and so forth. And it felt like it made sense. Well, of course, it always made sense. And I hope that when we come through this, please may it be soon, we will carry some of that with us. And not go back to thinking that, no, the violin doesn't belong in the hospital.
Right. Yeah.
That's really, really, really important, I think. And I think, similarly with, in other fields, I think there has been similar things with opening up of what creativity is. And I always look at all the people I know who are computer programmers who are also excellent musicians. And I think people think that if you're a hardcore computer programmer, you're on that side. That's actually really part of the same brain. Like the number of computer programmers who also have musical ability always astounds me. We run an open mic at the library, and half the people there are computer programmers.
Right.
Okay, we have a comment here from Amy Haddad, says that it sounds like your short essays are prose poetry and that she can't wait to read it. So Amy, I would encourage you to click that purchase button I put up there and read it. We also do have it in our library if you're local. And are there any other questions? I had a question actually from somebody on staff, which I'll ask, who couldn't be here tonight because they're at the library working. And they sent it to me by email. So if anybody else has a question, just go ahead and put it in the chat. Anyways, our staff member was wondering, like, do you attend, so our library, we have like a lot of writing groups, and we also know we keep track of them. So do either of you, this is for either of you, do you have a writing group that you belong to, that you go to for feedback? Your process of doing this, and how important, if you do belong to a writing group, how important is a writing group? Or is this something that you just do solitary?
I'll let the guest of honor answer first.
Oh, damn it. I wanted you to go first. I don't have a writing group. I wish I did, but I do not. And it's something that's really interesting because of that, I oftentimes I write slowly because, I end up writing and then putting things aside, and I have to let my brain clear so I can look at a piece of fresh. And so that's why I'm usually always working on several things simultaneously. And then once something sort of hits a rhythm, and I know I'm in, and all the time while I'm working on a particular piece, I'm thinking about something else I'm working on. And so that's sort of a way for me to at least come at the work with new eyes and different eyes. And fresh thinking, and it's but everyone's, I don't. I think I wish I did. However, I think I have something that sort of works for me a little bit, even though it's grossly inefficient. But I haven't exactly been efficient in my career.
I'm quite the opposite. I, sort of went around thinking about writing for years and years and years, wandering the shelves of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge and wishing my book was on the shelf, and wondering why, if I wasn't writing, my book wasn't on the shelf, and then finally. My husband said, after the 9,000th conversation we had about this, said, why don't you do what you know how to do, which is go to school? So I started taking writing courses at night, and then ultimately I got an MFA. And what I've done for the last 10 years, and what is really the only way I could have written a book, is I have a writing partner. We've been working together for 10 years. We met. She's a biographer. She's currently writing a biography of the art collector and museum founder Isabella Stewart Gardner for HarperCollins. We met because I reviewed her first book for the Boston Globe, and I really loved it. And she wrote me a thank you note, and we became friends. I feel like a writing group would be too much social temptation for me. But a writing partner, what's so great about that is, for those of you who don't write too much, here's what writing looks like. You get a great idea, and then you write it, and then it's horrible. It's horrible. It was so great, and now it's horrible. How could this happen? And what happens for most people, and I think particularly for most people in medicine, where we're not used to being horrible, we're used to just getting it done and getting it right, is that you just quit. So what happens is I get my great idea, I write it, it's horrible, and then I send it to my partner, Natalie, and she doesn't think it's horrible, but she also doesn't think it's brilliant, which is my other fantasy. You know, I either think it's brilliant or it's horrible. She says, you got a little something to work with here. And then I move to the next step, which is what needs to happen. I need a partner to get me there. I find it hard to do it without someone saying, no, it wasn't horrible. No, it's actually not brilliant. It's something else.
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we actually have our most popular writing group now at the library is creative nonfiction. I think there's a lot of people in this kind of liminal space where you guys are writing. And our regular writing group had so many people who were creative nonfiction. And then the fiction people were like, no, we do something different. So we actually have two writing groups now. We have a fiction group and we have a creative nonfiction.
Jay, you're a fiction writer too. We didn't even get to that, and we're at the hour. But you just quickly tell us, you wrote two bad novels, but then you published some fiction that clearly was not bad.
No.
So what's your first love, fiction or nonfiction?
Well, they both accomplished two different things. You know, I felt like I always feel like I write the book that I need to write, like this short, and so I never thought I'd write nonfiction, and I have, you know, Pat Skerritt at the first opinion editor at Stat, who was actually accepted one of my pieces, and I've been working with him on several pieces, because my pieces don't necessarily fit like the op-ed type, the typical op-ed framework. They're more narrative in structure. So I think I come my love for seeing and tearing apart a character, and my love of the complexity of things, I think, comes from my fiction side, and that allows me to sort of be what I find interesting in a nonfiction situation, and so I'm looking forward to I'm starting to, you know, write a little bit more fiction. I'm actually doing a little bit more both, but I'm having fun with both. Like we need all these different forms, right, Suzanne? I mean, it's like, that's the beautiful part of writing. It's like, I think the form and the form is related to the content, and the structure is related to what we're trying to say, and the emotions that we're trying to convey, and what we want the reader to experience. And I think we need to be adaptable. What I'd love to do, and I can't do, is I want to write poetry, but I can't.
You know, I have to just say finally, not to belabor this point, but I want to do fiction and poetry and nonfiction. Kind of sounds like someone who's attracted to the ER. Yeah, I want to intubate and pump stomachs and do psychiatry. Me, I'm still riding the same horse for 30 years. I'm a one genre gal.
Oh, you're but very, 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 very accomplished at that.
Yeah,
at that jaunt. And
you guys could be a comedy show on the road. I'm sorry.
Let's quit our jobs, Jay.
Let's do it. We're done.
Yeah, it's great. Well, this has been so great. I've dropped a few links into the chat for anybody that's here, linking to our book list of fall authors, and Jay's book is at the top of the list because he was the first of our fall authors. You can see who else is coming up, and if you want to check the book up in the Princeton Public Library, that's your link for you. And I also put the link in to purchase the book. It's available everywhere that fine books are sold. I'd encourage you to support your local independent bookstore, as I always do. Here in town, that's Labyrinth. And to stay up to date on all our events at the library, and also just, support small press, support university presses. They're so important. We have Princeton University Press here in town that we work with a lot. We love working with MIT Press, Rutgers Press. The university presses really are advancing, keeping information flowing out there at a high quality level. And they're so important, I think, to our publishing industry and to our democracy too. So thank you, MIT Press, for reaching out to do this event with the Princeton Public Library. We're very honored. Suzanne, Jay, it was an absolute pleasure to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
So this is the time of the conversation where we say good night and thank you, and we'll see you again, either
Thank you,
virtual or in
everybody.
person. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Suzanne.